Welcome to a special edition of Outright Proud podcast. I'm Matuba Mahlachi, Communications and Media Relations Manager at Outright International. We're about to get into critical issues shaping human rights and social justice around the world. In today's episode, we are focusing on the recent Constitutional Court ruling in Uganda that upheld the Anti-Homosexuality Act of 2023. This decision has sparked widespread debate and concern, particularly among LGBTQ activists and organizations. We are so honored to be joined by Frank Mugisha, who's Executive Director at Sexual Minorities Uganda, who is also a leading voice in the light of LGBTQ rights in Uganda. Together, we'll scrutinize the ruling, explore its implications, and gain valuable insights into the ongoing struggle for equality and justice. Join us as we engage in a thought-provoking conversation that sheds light on the challenges and aspirations of the LGBTQ people in Uganda. Frank, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us to this Outright Proud podcast. And please say hello to our listeners and properly introduce yourself.
Hello and good morning. Thank you very much for having me on this podcast, and thank you to Outright International for all the support to the LGBTQ community in Uganda, but also the LGBTQ plus community around the world. My name is Frank Mugisha. I am the Executive Director of Sexual Minorities Uganda SMUG, but also I am part of the Convening for Equality, which is a body that brings together civil society organizations and LGBTQ organizations to respond to the anti-gay legislation in Uganda.
Thank you so much, Frank. And, let's start with your initial thoughts and reaction to the Constitutional Court ruling regarding the Anti-Homosexuality Act of 2023 in Uganda.
The ruling itself was very disappointing for me. My first reaction was disappointment, and that followed with really sadness and worry. One, for the community, for the LGBT community, the safety of the community, the language and the words that were used by the Ugandan judiciary when delivering the appeal. These were words that were worrying, but words that could potentially incite violence towards the LGBTQ community. The judges mentioned that part of the reason the Anti-Homosexuality Act was upheld in Uganda was because of public interest, which means that the public is given a green light to go ahead and violate the LGBTQ community. So that worried me so much. I was very disappointed, but at the same time worried for the safety of the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, your worry is very warranted. The ruling upheld the law while scrapping only 2 sections and 2 subsections. What are your insights into the specific aspects of the law that the court addressed?
So the court addressed itself to the provision on access to health and then the privacy of the LGBT community, and then upheld parts of the law that were very extreme, for instance, the death penalty. And then number 2 is retained, or rather, the law still punishes promotion of homosexuality. So for me, everything, the 2 sections that were removed do not make sense at all if you're going to say that LGBTQ persons can access health services with no discrimination, and at the same time you're saying that any information, health information, any information on HIV and AIDS, any information on health to the LGBT community could be perceived as promotion of homosexuality. All organizations that are running support for the LGBTQ community on health, that could be promotion of homosexuality. The organizing that the community does, this is the organizing that enables the LGBT community that has been marginalized very much, and this is a very, very difficult to reach community by many of the health practitioners. So the organizing in the country helps the LGBT community to create the demand for the services that are available in health, but also a peer-to-peer encouragement to go for the health services and provide the much needed legal information on access to health and health information and availability of these services where they can be found. And that can only be done through community organizing. But this law outlaws community organizing. So it does not make sense at all what was removed. In my own personal opinion, I felt like the removing of the allowing access to health by the judiciary is speaking to international donors, because there was so much reaction from many of the donors who fund Uganda's Ministry of Health and who fund the government of Uganda's health budget. So for that budget to be fully funded and for the World Bank to reconsider the mitigations that they're working on at this moment, the judiciary had to allow or say access to health is allowed. But then when you go ahead and look at the language and what was kept is very draconian and still very problematic, and would never be successful in achieving any health services for the LGBT community.
And just on that point, thank you so much, Frank, on the donors. One of the strongest news angles I saw coming out about this ruling highlights the potential impact on donor funding and international relationships. How do you foresee those factors shaping future legal and advocacy efforts for LGBTQ rights in Uganda?
I mean, we've done so much work as the LGBT community in the country. Our civil society partners, our lawyers have done a great job, but we can't underscore the importance of the donor community. And we know that when the law was first introduced, there were many donors who responded to Uganda and simply telling Ugandan government and other government agencies that it is going to be very difficult for the donors to continue providing funding to certain sectors because of the implementation if this law is in place. And I believe it is going to be the same. Nothing is going to change. That so many donors are going to come back and say this law being upheld by the court is going to affect future funding. And for advocacy reasons like we're talking about now, is that then it enables the Ugandan society to have a more critical conversation about this legislation and why do we need it as Ugandans if it is affecting our own budgets, where the members of parliament, in line with bringing up this legislation that is based on conspiracy theories, and yet it is affecting the country's national budgets. And again, for the government of Uganda to take this as a very serious matter, and therefore the courts to work on expediting our petition. So I believe in advocacy. It helps in expediting the court process. One, creates a high-level conversation around the issue. And number two, makes Ugandans rethink, do we need this anti-gay legislation that are purely based on conspiracy theories and yet affecting our national budgets?
And Frank, some of us in the movement are concerned about the ruling being influenced by the politics of the day. Could you elaborate on the political context and its potential impact on the ruling we got?
Yes, definitely. So what happens is many politicians take advantage of anything that can get them popularity. And the anti-gay legislation is very popular in Uganda. It is supported by very many Ugandans. And of course, many Ugandans support it naively. They are ignorant of LGBTQ human rights. So they just go with what they read in the media, unfortunately, which is negative. And so they believe the law is good for the country. And now politicians are building on that. Politicians are using the anti-gay legislation to divert the attention of the public. They are using the anti-gay legislation to cover up for their failures to their constituencies on the deliverables they promised during the campaigns. And now Uganda is moving again into the election period. We are seeing this happening. Just 2 weeks ago, when Parliament was being held accountable by Ugandan citizens, the Speaker of the House, who is the Speaker of the Ugandan Parliament, pulled out the anti-gay card and said she's being fought because she passed the anti-gay legislation, and called everyone speaking out against corruption a homosexual.
Wow. So this is a clear deflection of the real issues of the people of Uganda, which is very interesting. And having said that, though, Frank, do you see the passage of this Anti-Homosexuality Act and the recent ruling as linked to a broader regression of human rights and democratic principles in Uganda? I mean, do democracy and human rights actors in Ugandan civil society take this seriously as a threat that extends beyond LGBTQ Ugandans? Because it does.
Unfortunately, many of the human rights organizations and civil society groups do not take this very serious. They don't see this as a threat to democracy, rule of law, and shrinking civic space. We've been drumming this up for a very long time and telling civil society groups, please join us. Today it is the LGBT community. Tomorrow it is going to be another human rights organization. But because of the propaganda and the misinformation that has been spread by the anti-rights groups in the country, many civil society groups are not willing to align themselves with this LGBTQ community. That is very unfortunate. We have a few that are working with us and are listening, but it is a very few and a handful.
Where did you find the potential impact of misinformation surrounding the ruling and its effects on public perception and advocacy efforts? Can you share your perspective on how misinformation may be influencing the discourse around LGBTQ rights in Uganda?
Very much so. I'll give you a bit of a background. Prior to the introduction of the anti-gay legislation, there were systematic campaigns in the country, and these were heavily funded and supported by anti-gay and anti-rights groups in the country. They paid influencers on social media to spread misinformation and disinformation. They targeted key activists like myself, key organizations like Sexual Minorities Uganda. In fact, prior to the introduction of the legislation, Sexual Minorities Uganda was shut down because of this misinformation that was spreading in social media. There were systematic campaigns organized by the anti-gay groups. They radicalized Ugandans. You would notice that when the anti-gay legislation was introduced in our parliament, it wasn't as tough as it was by the time it left the parliament. The reaction from the members of parliament who were calling for killing of gay people, one member of parliament said gay people should be castrated. They were saying that gay people should be hanged. Extreme measures. This was how the public in Uganda was at that moment because of the radicalization that was happening from the misinformation and disinformation. And the majority of this misinformation was majorly on Twitter, which is X now, TikTok, and mostly in WhatsApp groups. So this misinformation was spreading, and we saw this misinformation manifest into actual violence. I received as many death threats personally, and many Ugandans received threats. Many LGBTQ Ugandans received threats, but also physical violence towards very many LGBTQ persons based on this misinformation and conspiracy theories. My 2 colleagues were arrested and detained based on this misinformation. I was charged under very many allegations. I was investigated by all security organs in the country because of this misinformation and disinformation that was funded and paid for by anti-gay rights groups. And unfortunately, many of them who are supporting this are from the United States.
That's quite a shame, and they also seem a bit organized, which leads me to my next question about capacitating Ugandan activists. Is there more that international donors, such as the United States that you've just mentioned, the European Union, and others could do? Now as someone in the front lines with other activists in Uganda, have you seen any proactive interventions from donors?
Yes, I have seen that. I've seen some of the international partners intervene very well. For instance, I would say the United States did respond to Uganda's anti-gay legislation, one, by issuing visa sanctions, providing travel advisory, and also engaging at high-level diplomatic bilateral relations with our government and many of our politicians. So we saw the US government respond very well. However, the EU was very reluctant in responding, including one of the EU leaders saying they will continue supporting Uganda despite having this draconian legislation in place. The World Bank responded positively by withholding a loan to Uganda, and for the first time ever, this prompted very well proper advocacy with the LGBT community on the ground with the World Bank, but also for the first time, the Ugandan LGBT community and civil society are involved on working with the World Bank to see that all the projects that are running in Uganda have proper mitigations, and these mitigations are aimed at making sure no one is left behind. The projects include diversity and are very inclusive. So there has been, from some of the response, there have been positive long-term implications that could be beneficial for the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, and it's comforting to hear that there is some kind of, intervention that's coming from international donors. And having gone through this twice over, Frank, what advice do you have for activists in countries faced with possibility of such repressive laws? I mean, you can think of Ghana, Kenya, Malawi. Everybody is not many countries are immune to what you're going through. So what advice do you have for activists in countries faced with the possibility of such repressive laws?
So my advice with countries that are faced with such laws, and we're seeing really the ripple effect around, almost going around the entire Africa. And for me, it is for countries to start working now. And first of all, put in safety and security measures for the LGBT community, because once the debate starts on the Anti-Homosexuality Act, it is the LGBT community that suffers the most. Majority of community members are discriminated, but they face so much violence. We've seen hundreds and hundreds of cases come out of Uganda because of this anti-gay legislation. Similarly, we saw that happen many years ago when the law came up in Nigeria. And we saw the conversation, when the conversation was starting in Tanzania, many LGBTQ persons suffered violence. We've seen LGBTQ persons start getting arrested in Burundi and Somaliland, and Ghana recently passed a similar law. So my suggestion is that for the community to put in place structures that can support safety and protection. Documentation of these violations is very important, because these violations happen, but then we cannot prove persecution and prosecution without documenting these violations. So it is very important. And then secondly, we do want the community members to start mobilizing civil society organizations and partners on the ground and have one common voice before going to the international community. And then definitely engage the international community and try to get a quick response. And we've been asking many of our partners to treat Uganda with the utmost urgency so that this ripple effect doesn't happen in other countries. And unfortunately, some of the partners have, again, not taken this as very serious as they should have, but some have. Definitely, we've got a lot of support. I can't undermine that. Uganda has gotten so much support from all around the world, but I believe we should still treat this with utmost urgency. And unfortunately, the same people who are in Uganda and Ghana erasing our human rights are the same people who are undermining all the gains that have been made in the United States and other countries, are the same people in Eastern Europe trying to support anti-gay legislations, where we are seeing in Russia LGBTQ persons being called terrorists. So if we're not careful, it's going to be a global crisis for the LGBT community at some point.
We really hope it doesn't come to that. I really hope personally it doesn't come to that. And my final question, not necessarily even a question, but I want to ask you, Frank, what your call to regional actors is, which includes members and allies of the movement. What would be, your call to them?
Our regional actors, and I think I'm happy to name South Africa and the leadership of South Africa, the political leadership of South Africa, the president of South Africa. South Africa has one of the best constitutions. South Africa is well placed in the African region because South Africa works and does business with many African nations. They have the mandate, they have it in their will. They have the power to change things on the continent. They can engage with African leaders and show them why these laws are not necessary and these laws are very bad for human rights and for businesses. And many other countries that are progressive on the continent should be engaging their own peers, Angola, Botswana, Mauritius, and speaking out against this anti-gay legislation. They should show the world that Africa is not a place for homophobia. And Africa should not be seen as a place for homophobia. So for the regional partners who work on human rights, we need solidarity. We need regional partners to look at the urgency and to know that the anti-race and the anti-gay movement, the opposition, is not only going after LGBTQ human rights. The anti-gay legislations are only an entry point, but the anti-race and anti-gay movement is going after women's rights, children's rights, reproductive health. In many countries, it has been very difficult to pass the comprehensive sexuality education curriculum because this has been fought by anti-rights. In many countries, it is very difficult for women to have the right of choice. They are bringing up very, very conservative abortion laws. In many countries, they are dictating on how women should dress. In some countries, they bring up legislation that would outlaw a woman who is not married from accessing IVF. So these conservative ideologies are not only around anti-gay legislations. We want a cross-cutting movement that involves women's rights, reproductive health, and LGBTQ human rights to come into solidarity in the region and fight us.
Thank you. I really hope the regional actors are listening. And I'm talking to you from South Africa in Pretoria, where we, in a few weeks' time, will be having a new government. And I hope the new government will be listening to your voice, Frank, to live up to what our constitution say and the mandate that the people have given them to protect human rights. And I really hope this call is heeded. And as we conclude today's episode, we extend our heartfelt gratitude to Frank Mugisha, Executive Director at Sexual Minorities Uganda, or SMUG as we know it, for sharing their insights and experiences with us. Frank's unwavering dedication to advancing LGBTQ rights in Uganda is truly inspiring. We really are inspired by you, Frank, and the work that you do. And we hope this episode has provided you, the listener, with a deeper understanding of the complexities surrounding the recent constitutional ruling and the continuing struggle for equality and justice. Remember, the fight for human rights is ongoing, and it's crucial to stay informed and engaged. We encourage you to continue supporting LGBTQ activists and organizations both in Uganda and around the world. Thank you for tuning in to this special episode of Outright Proud, produced by communications team at Outright International. Until next time, from me, Matuba Mahlachi, take care and keep advocating for better LGBTQ lives outright. Frank, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.